AM 1130 and 103.5 FM. I'm laughing because it's a wild morning. It's Inauguration Day. That's a big deal. Got a lot of guests on the show today, including, we'll talk with lawyer extraordinaire Jeff O'Brien here in just a moment. I'd sent out a post about all the guests that we have on today. Got Tom Emmer coming up top of the hour, and I think I forgot to put Jeff on there initially, so my apologies for that. I also have a new water heater being installed today, so I have Dean's reaching out to me to let me know that they are on their way with the new water heater. So it's a very, very busy morning here on Twin Cities News Talk.
Good morning. Is this the Boston Scientific implanted pacemaker support line? A little concerned about my heart rate. At the Trump inauguration, Minnesota Supreme Court ruled against the Democrats. I'm concerned that if Paul Wickstrom gets in, it might push it over the edge. Will the device handle that?
I am not a cardiologist. I can play one on the radio, but I would not be the individual to go and give you the advice necessary on that. But I do appreciate the comment this morning. All right, before we talk with Jeff, just real quick. The Minnesota Supreme Court, this is one of the items we'll be talking about with the lawyer extraordinaire, did rule Friday evening that Governor Tim Walz prematurely called for the election to fill a vacancy in House District 40B. Now, if you heard the conversation that I had with Rob Dorr from the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus and law expert last week on Thursday, he said that this particular lawsuit and what was being argued in front of the Supreme Court was the more subjective between this and the issue of the quorum. Be that as it may, under the Minnesota statute, the writ of a special election for House District 40B was issued prematurely and therefore must be quashed, the court said unanimously. This is what Walz had to say shortly after the ruling.
Now, or that starts the clock ticking.
Yeah, this is the question on the quorum. It sure appears like the Supreme Court ruled today on that there's not a quorum, and that's what this said, that there's not a quorum to do it. So I think that question is settled, and so they'll have to get to the 68, which you're going to, as you get past.
Very odd. I don't know why that was sped up the way that it was. But basically in the clip, and we'll try to get you a slowed down version. In the clip, Walz said that he said the courts went and settled the issue of the quorum. So one of many questions we have for lawyer extraordinaire Jeff O'Brien this morning. So what is Walz talking about? Why does he make the comment that he seems to be of the opinion that the special election and it being quashed also meant that the state Supreme Court was giving their thoughts on the quorum issue?
Well, John, thanks for having me on again. I have no idea what he's talking about. Melissa Hortman said much the same thing on Almanac Friday night, that this somehow that this case settles the quorum case, but the quorum case is a separate case. They're having hearings later this week, so I don't get where they're coming from, other than they just figure, well, it's the Minnesota media, so we can just say what we want and they won't challenge us. I'm not getting it. I mean, the case was about the timing of the governor calling this special election and the fact that he didn't have the right to do so because there wasn't a vacancy to trigger it. Unlike in the Senate in District 60, where Senator Dietzig passed away, creating the vacancy so he can call a special election. There wasn't anything until session actually, kicks in, and I think the contrary argument applies, is he's going to have to recognize, if the Democrats want to continue this boycott, the governor's going to have to recognize the House as constituted if he wants to call this special election, because until somebody's not seated in the 40B seat, there's no vacancy.
Right. Yeah, John Phelan in Center of the American Experiment put out a lengthy piece. He calls it Walz and his catch-22, and you're right. I'll just read to the last part here. I'm repeating a bit of what you said, but that's the quandary. To recognize the House issue the writ and hold the election early, but he'd have to acknowledge, as you mentioned, the legitimacy of everything the House has done so far, or refuse to recognize the House, ignore the resolution, and hold the election weeks later. Now, I got a number of questions around what the Supreme Court did Friday relating to the special election, but does the issue of whatever ruling that the Minnesota Supreme Court has relating to the quorum, whether or not it is an actual number of 68 or it just means the majority of the body that's present at the time, Does that have any further impact on Walz and this quandary that he's in right now?
Well, to the extent that if the court rules that a quorum is a majority of the members present, and if there's 133 members currently, that a quorum is 67, that would then seem to have to end the House DFL standoff and get their butts back into their seats to do their job. And then at that point, the governor can call the special election because there wouldn't be anybody seated in 40B, and the residents of that district, need representation.
So Rob Dorr for the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus, and thanks for listening, Rob. Just real quick, talking with lawyer extraordinaire Jeff O'Brien. So just to make sure that we're clear on what Rob said, Rob was talking about relating to the issue of the special election, that there was conflicting statutes, not that it was more subjective. That was sort of my view of what Rob had said, but I want to be clear on what Rob had said, that there were conflicting statutes, and that way and I believe I'm fair in saying this, he wasn't sure exactly which way the Supreme Court would go, unlike what's the situation may or may not be with the quorum issue. He does agree with you, though, Jeff. The quorum was absolutely not addressed in the Supreme Court's decision. So I think we're all kind of sitting back and scratching our heads over what Governor Tim Walz and Melissa Hortman not just have been saying on this issue, but like what Walz said last week. And let me play the clip really quick before all this went down.
I would encourage them to get this done, though. I mean, the voters, I respect elections. On November 6th, I was on the phone conceding an election. That's what you do. And it's 67-67. It's not temporarily for 12 days, and we're going to take power for 2 years.
It's stunning to me, because that's absolutely what it is. Right now, the makeup of the legislature is temporary, depending on what the outcome of 40B is whenever that special election takes place. And because of that, it is 67-66. So again, Walz last week, before the Supreme Court issued their ruling on the special election issue, in my opinion, Jeff O'Brien, he's just straight up lying to the public in comments like that.
Yeah, he is, again. And I hope, again, like you were talking about last week, John, I really hope that the Supreme Court considers the ramifications of this quorum decision. I think it was Walter Hudson that mentioned some of them. You do have from time to time members who are, unfortunately, like we see in the Senate, pass away or are not able to be present because of illness or something else, right? And if you stake the claim on that a quorum has to be 68, you're not necessarily going to have, 68 members. Who knows what's going to happen? So I don't know what's, there's a difference between quorum and the requirements for voting. That's always been the case. There's nothing that says that the Republicans can be passing a whole bunch of bills without the participation of Democrats. But
and they've acknowledged such, and they did last week.
Exactly. This is just a matter of, for a 2-week period, the Republicans are going to have a majority of members and have the ability to take over leadership for 2 years. And this talking point that the Democrats keep putting out, that Minnesotans voted for a tied House. No, they didn't. 67 districts voted for a Republican, and 67 voted for a Democrat. It just happened that one of the 67 Democrat districts were voting for a guy that wasn't eligible to run for the seat. So nobody goes out and votes for the political makeup of, or the partisan makeup of the Minnesota House of Representatives. They vote for a particular representative. It just happened that the chips fell in a 67-67 tie on November 5th.
Well, yeah, and at the moment, when it comes to that House District 40B, it's a brand new race right now. I mean, and nobody's talking. I mean, we're talking about it, but the rest of the media isn't, because a lot of things can happen. Is it favored for the DFL? Of course it is. That being said, right now, you've got a myriad of dynamics in play. They don't know when the election is taking place. They don't know what the candidates are going to do in terms of campaigning. The new candidate hasn't really introduced himself to the people of that area. He has to go out and campaign. So it is beyond ridiculous to go and make this assumption that it's just a foregone conclusion that 40B is going to fall to the Democrats, and therefore Republicans need to just go ahead and act like that's already occurred. Let me add one more thing into this. William wrote in to justice@iheartradio.com, talking with lawyer extraordinaire Jeff O'Brien. How come nobody's talking about that none of the Democrats are sworn in? I know it's some reason, and I know why. It's because they've ignored it now. But like that secret swearing-in ceremony that took place 2 Sundays ago, like nobody is discussing that or having a debate about whether or not it's legitimate, wherein I believe that it's not legitimate. It's just funny how they did that when, technically speaking, right now, the House DFL isn't even sworn in, hasn't even taken the oath to begin their time during this 94th legislative session.
That's a good question. There's a lot of questions surrounding the super secret ceremony. I think a lot of folks want to ask retired Judge Burke, did they show you election certificates? What proof did they give you that they were entitled to take the oath?
Yeah, and nobody has asked that question, and I don't know. And
when they get sworn in the House itself, the way the Republicans did this time, those election certificates are there. Were they present at the History Center when they did that swearing-in ceremony?
Yeah.
That's a big question.
So let's go here. So the Minnesota senator representing Woodbury, responding after being charged with breaking into a home on that early morning to attempt to steal items that she said had family connections. Of course, this goes back to last year, and we're talking about the alleged Minnesota DF felon, Nicole Mitchell. The trial for DFL Senator Nicole Mitchell now delayed until after the end of the Minnesota legislative session. It was scheduled to start on January 27th. Let me ask you this question up front, lawyer extraordinaire Jeff O'Brien. Is this simply because I was trying to kind of get into the justification of this, and how much of this is you are innocent until proven guilty, and therefore she should be allowed to go and do the work that she was elected for? I mean, how much of that played into, in your mind, the judge's decision to delay the start of her hearing until after the legislative session?
Well, I haven't seen a case before, maybe I'm wrong, but of a non-politician having their criminal trial delayed because they have to go to work.
That was my next question.
I have to. There's two things. Number one, just point of fact, the judge in that case was appointed by the previous Democrat governor, Mark Dayton. But also, I can't help but think that the chaos that has ensued on the House side in St. Louis and with these court cases didn't impact the judge's decision in his ruling that they're going to delay the trial, because if the trial is ongoing and she's not present to vote, now you're going to have the same issues. You're going to have the same issues that they have on the House right now on the Senate side. And maybe the judge, part of the thinking was, I'm not going to, throw both sides into chaos. But, for me, there's the famous saying, justice delayed is justice denied. And everybody's talking about, Senator Mitchell and the legislative calendar and all this, but, there's a victim here. Her stepmother, whose house she broke into, is being denied justice because the ultimate decision on the actions of her stepdaughter are being delayed because of, in my opinion, because of political concerns.
Now, where is the line for a judge, tongue-tied this morning, where's the line when it comes to a judge and their discretion to make decisions based off of ancillary issues? And so we see this happen at the, on sort of the U.S. Supreme Court level, and arguments relating to, what kind of impact does this have on, say, something as big as an upcoming election? Here, Jeff O'Brien, you mentioned that perhaps they're looking at the situation in the House and making a call not to throw more turmoil into what's taking place at the Capitol during this legislative session. But where is the line there in terms of a judge making that decision? And in this case, ultimately delaying this trial, if that again was their reasoning. And I know it's not party exclusive on this, but I'm just kind of wondering, what are your thoughts on the judge making a decision based off those types of factors?
Judges do have quite a bit of discretion in a lot of different cases, John. What's usually the check and balance on the exercise of that discretion is judges, district court judges in particular, don't like being overturned by appellate courts. So that sort of kind of puts guardrails on the exercise of judicial discretion, because if you get overturned too many times, you get an opponent running against you for your district court seat, because the district court judges have to run for a re-election every once in a while, and that can get brought up. It's unlikely, but it still gets, it's still a pain to have to deal with, and dealing with an opponent in a judicial election. So there's that, but I don't know. I don't pretend to be a criminal attorney. I don't know if this would even be a appealable decision on the part of the prosecution. And so maybe that's what the judge is thinking, is they're not going to be able to appeal, so I'm just going to do what I think I should do here. And I think that, creating chaos in St. Paul is a bigger factor than moving forward with this trial right now.
Let's move on to, and we haven't talked about this much on the show. There's a piece out of The Hill as we continue in the conversation with lawyer extraordinaire Jeff O'Brien. More activism, less credibility. What CNN's defamation loss says about journalism today. I'll just read a couple of points from this piece from The Hill. Your credibility with me is about none. Those words to CNN counsel Judge William Henry also clearly spoke for the Florida jury, which on Friday awarded $5 million for Navy veteran Zachary Young and approved an additional amount still to be determined for punitive damages. A segment aired on CNN's The Lead with Jake Tapper going back to November 11th of 2021 and trashed Young in a story about Afghans being preyed upon by groups promising to get them out of the country amid the disastrous withdrawal of the U.S. forces. Tapper told his audience ominously how the CNN correspondent Alex Marquardt discovered that Afghans trying to get out of the country face a black market full of promises, demands of exorbitant fees, and no guarantee of safety concerns. Marquardt detailed how desperate Afghans were being exploited and needed to pay an exorbitant, often impossible amounts, and then named Young and his company as examples. The trial revealed internal messages for Marquardt that he wanted to nail this Zachary Young blanker, and thought the story would be Young's funeral, promising to nail Young. To which the CNN editor Matthew Phillips responded and said that he was going to hold you to that cowboy. And then the CNN editor also described Young as words I can't say on the radio. So with that, Jeff O'Brien, what do you make of this win for this Navy veteran?
Well, I think I look at it more as a loss for CNN. I believe that they've now since settled with him after the ruling came down. And if I recall right, that's two in the column for CNN on defamation cases. There was the high school student a couple of years ago, and his name escapes me, for the first one. And then you have the ABC defamation suit that was, with Trump that was settled. And the ladies on The View are having to read legal notes every other day.
Right.
I think that's kind of one of the underlying stories not reported as much, partly because, you have the media to report it. But I think the biggest loser in this last election cycle is the traditional media. There was a time where you had your three channels, you had your print newspapers, and a lot of people, the majority of people, derived their news from those sources. And they were, they have shaped the narrative in this country for a long, long time. And I definitely think, given there definitely has been a more activist bent amongst journalists in more recent years, and I think it just gets heightened and heightened every year goes by. And then, of course, with Elon Musk purchasing X and sort of creating this free speech platform with community notes and all that kind of stuff, I definitely think we're watching the leveling of the playing field and they're reacting to it too, and the fact that they're not liking that they're not having this ability to shape the narrative any longer. And I think when these media outlets are owned by corporate interests, and they're having to write out settlement checks or pay lawyers for these lawsuits, that's going to affect their hiring practices. So it's going to be really curious, really interesting to see where this goes in the coming years, because I think they really got smacked this last 2 years.
Jeff O'Brien, I got about a minute left, but really quick. The initial story heading into the weekend was the U.S. Senate blocking the lifeline for TikTok, saying that unless the U.S. Supreme Court intervenes, which they didn't, Sunday marked the deadline set by the bipartisan lawmakers and Joe Biden for the social media app's parent company ByteDance to sell it or have it banned in the app stores. Now, it hasn't returned in the app stores. You can go back to using TikTok right at the moment. Trump has said he's going to issue an executive order on this. So is the Supreme Court's sort of aspect of what's taking place with TikTok, is that over now? Or do you expect more will take place relating to TikTok's future and its availability in America?
I think we'll hear more on this. If President Trump does issue an executive order, there are standards under that act that allow the president to intervene. There might be a follow-up case as to the validity of his intervention. We don't know the details of it yet. But just one thing is, when you're dealing with First Amendment, and a lot of people are talking about First Amendment and TikTok, but the court said on Friday these were content neutral, provisions that were put into this act in terms of protecting national security, protecting data collection, guarding against data collection by the Chinese government. So they said it didn't impact the content creators or the content creation or any of what was being shared on the site. It was more about the backroom side and the collection of data, and China's being able to put narratives out into TikTok to sway opinion in this country. So we'll see where it goes. I think there's a lot more to be said and done here when it comes to TikTok and this act.
Lawyer extraordinaire Jeff O'Brien, thank you for the time this morning. Happy Inauguration Day, and we'll talk to you again real soon.
Same to you. Thanks, John.